April 21st, 1945. Germany between Doberg and Lintorf, a clearing in the woodland. Among the trees, Field Marshal Walter Model stood by himself, his service weapon weighing heavily. The remains of Army Group B, which consisted of almost 300,000 troops who had given themselves up to American forces in the days before, were behind him. An impossible, non-choice spread out in front of him. He couldn't break his word by giving up. He would not be held captive by the Soviet Union for his country. More than one man was killed in the gunshot that echoed through those woods that afternoon. It represented the pinnacle of a phenomena that would continue to elude military historians for many years to come. Nearly 3 million German soldiers gave themselves up to American and Western Allied forces between March and May 1945. They frequently walked miles through their own defensive lines to get to American positions, dropping their weapons without firing a shot, and emerging from fortified positions with white flags made out of tablecloths and bedsheets. They gave up not because the war was lost, not because their lines had fallen, and not even because their ammo had run out. They gave up explicitly, consciously, and frantically in order to avoid being captured by the Soviet Red Army, which was their worst fear. Unprecedented mass surrender is depicted by the figures. Over 2.8 million German soldiers surrendered to Western Allied forces on the Northwest European Front between June 6, 1944, when Allied forces assaulted the beaches of Normandy, and April 30, 1945, the day Hitler died in his Berlin bunker. 1.5 million of these enormous numbers gave up in April 1945 alone. Every day during the first 2 weeks of that month, 39,000 Germans gave up. That figure reached a peak of 59,000 each day in the last 16 days. These men sacrificed their lives while Hitler was still alive, the Nazi regime was still in power, and military law still required them to fight to the death. They had defense positions, guns, and ammo. The desire to face eastward, where the Red Army advanced like an unstoppable machine of retaliation and revenge, was what they required. It is necessary to comprehend what almost 3 million German soldiers understood about two very different outcomes in order to comprehend why they would decide to surrender rather than continue to resist. In 1945, the reports from the East had reached every German soldier on the Western Front. Whispered talks, letters that passed military censorship, and the 1,000-yard glances of men who had been moved west from the Eastern Front were all ways they spread. These were not propaganda stories meant to inspire opposition. These were the accounts of men who had personally seen what transpired after German forces were captured by the Soviet Union. They were aware of the capitulation of 91,000 Sixth Army survivors at Stalingrad in February 1943. They were aware that only about 6,000 of the 91,000 men would ever make it back home. The remaining individuals perished in the months after surrendering due to malnutrition, illness, exposure, and forced work while in Soviet custody. They were aware of the death marches, in which Soviet troops shot German prisoners who were unable to keep up, as they were pushed hundreds of miles into the Russian interior, without proper food, drink, or rest. They were aware of the harsh conditions that contributed to the deaths of more than 1 million German inmates prior to 1956, the labor battalions in the Urals, and the mining camps in Siberia. They were aware of these things as statistical certainties, rather than as remote possibilities. Out of 360,000 captured German POWs, 194,250 perished in Soviet custody, according to the West German Maschke Commission, which was set up after the war to look into the fates of prisoners of war. Even when the gunfire ceased, this meant a German soldier thinking about surrendering had a greater than 1 in 3 chance of dying. However, survival statistics were only one aspect of the anxiety that propelled Germans westward. It was rooted in a deep understanding of the actions of German forces in the Soviet Union. German forces had fought what they themselves referred to as a Vernichtungskrieg, or War of Destruction, since June 22, 1941, when Operation Barbarossa began the biggest military assault in human history. Slavic peoples were labeled Untermenschen, subhumans suitable solely for slavery or annihilation, according to Nazi ideology. In order to establish Lebensraum, or dwelling space for German settlers, German planners had devised plans for the systematic starvation of 30 million Soviet civilians. Out of 5.7 million seized Soviet POWs, the Wehrmacht purposefully starved 3.3 million of them to death, resulting in a 57% death rate. In contrast, only 3.5% of American and British prisoners of war perished while in German captivity. 2 million of the 6 million Jews who were slaughtered were killed on Soviet soil by German forces, who had a direct hand in the Holocaust. They had destroyed entire communities through collective punishment measures, torched villages, and killed partisans and suspected partisans along with their families. German hands were defiled by the blood of 26 million Soviet soldiers and civilians. Whether he had personally fired a shot or lit a torch, every German soldier in 1945 was aware of this. They realized that when Soviet forces attacked them, they were not just hostile military forces, but also tools of just retaliation for unimaginable crimes. There could not have been a more striking contrast with American forces. From the initial moments of contact, German forces were confronted with an American style of warfare that contradicted all of the information provided by Nazi propaganda about their adversaries. Their expectations were confused by the treatment German soldiers experienced. American forces strictly adhered to international law regarding prisoners of war, as directed by Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight Eisenhower. There was medical attention. There were enough rations given out. The injured were treated. The requirements of the Geneva Convention were not broken by the execution, torture, or forced labor of prisoners. The word about American treatment got over German lines more quickly than any official message could have. Occasionally, soldiers who had previously surrendered were detained in makeshift enclosures that were visible from German defensive positions. Their compatriots could witness them alive, largely undamaged, getting sustenance and medical care. This visual affirmation of survival outperformed all propaganda in terms of impact. Many had made the calculation clear when the 317,000 troops of the Ruhr Pocket started to surrender in large numbers between April 14 and April 18, 1945. They had to decide whether to break out westward into American positions or eastward toward German lines in Soviet pursuit due to encirclement and running out of supplies. Instead of openly surrendering, Field Marshal Model had disbanded Army Group B, so implicitly allowing his men to make their own decisions. Most of them went west on foot. The strategic decision was a kind of national self-preservation as well as individual self-preservation. In May 1945, astute Germans realized that the fate of their country hinged on the willingness of the Western Allies, especially the Americans, to allow German reconstruction instead of Soviet-style exploitation and occupation. Months before, when military realities made German defeat inevitable, the wave of surrenders in spring 1945 had started to take shape. Following the establishment of American, British, and Canadian forces beachhead in Normandy on June 6, 1944, the Western Front gradually tightened into a noose. France was freed by Allied forces by September. Despite the Battle of the Bulge's brief defeat, they were at Germany's western frontier by December. The Soviet juggernaut, which had been accumulating since the triumph at Stalingrad, was relentlessly moving westward on the Eastern Front. The largest German defeat in military history occurred when Operation Bagration, which was initiated on June 22, 1944, the third anniversary of Barbarossa, devastated the German Army Group Center and cost Germany between 400,000 and 450,000 casualties in 9 weeks. Soviet forces were on German territory in East Prussia by January 1945, and they had moved within 100 kilometers of Berlin. With its personnel decimated, its industrial capability damaged by strategic bombing, and its fuel supplies almost gone, the German force found itself in a strategic vice, sandwiched between two enormous Allied armies. However, the important reality that compelled German soldiers to make their last-ditch decision was that these two Allied forces meant two entirely different futures for Germans who had been captured. The degree to which the German leadership acknowledged this fact and made an effort to take advantage of it was demonstrated by their early 1945 policy choices. Following Hitler's demise on April 30th, Admiral Dönitz took over as head of Germany and continued what historians would later refer to as a strategy of sequential partial capitulations in the West. His objective was to buy time so that as many Eastern military formations as possible might be brought westward and turned over intact to the British and Americans, avoiding Soviet or Yugoslav captivity. This was made clear in German documents that were recovered and are currently housed in the National Archives. Dönitz tried to negotiate separate surrenders to Western Allied forces while still fighting the Soviets, starting with the Italian capitulation on April 29, 1945. On May 4th, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery agreed to the surrender of German soldiers in Denmark, the Netherlands, and Northwest Germany. General Alfred Jodl made the offer to surrender all forces against the Western Allies, while still fending off Soviet forces, when he arrived at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Reims on May 6th. This tactic was destroyed by General Eisenhower's reaction. If Germany did not accept to unconditional surrender on all fronts at once, he threatened to cut off all German troops from the West and force them to surrender to the Soviets. At 2:41 a.m., Jodl signed the unconditional surrender after being given this ultimatum. In Reims on May 7, 1945, bringing the European war to a close, the Soviets demanded a second signing ceremony in Berlin-Karlshorst on May 8, with Soviet participation, which they regarded as the official legal surrender, because they were concerned that they had been left out of a separate peace. Perhaps the most spectacular example of German desperation to escape Soviet captivity is the Battle of Halbe. The remains of the German Ninth Army, which consisted of some 200,000 soldiers and tens of thousands of civilian refugees, were surrounded by Soviet forces in a dwindling area southeast of Berlin between April 24 and May 1, 1945. Knowing that surrender to the Soviets would probably result in death, their leader, General Theodor Busse, authorized a breakout attempt westward into American forces near the Elbe River. The result was a carnage. The pocket was brutally pounded by Soviet infantry, tanks, and artillery. With the fire of desperation, German forces struggled to break through the Soviet ring and reach the Americans, not to accomplish any military goals. About one-third of the besieged German soldiers managed to escape through to the American lines, making up about 30,000 of the Germans' partial breakout success. It is estimated that between 24,000 and 60,000 people died overall, including both military troops and civilians. In contrast, about 10,000 people, including civilians, foreign workers, and irregular forces, were killed and 317,000 captured during the Battle of the Ruhr Pocket, where the Germans capitulated to the Americans. The difference clearly indicates which outcome the German soldiers favored. According to the findings of the German government's own post-war inquiry, which was led by Erich Maschke, the Soviet Union captured almost 3 million German prisoners of war, 194,150 of whom perished in captivity between 1941 and 1955. The committee recorded that, following the conclusion of the conflict, 549,360 people perished between 1941 and April 1945, and 542,911 perished between May 1945 and June 1950. These numbers depict systematic mortality and are taken from Soviet archives and German records. In Soviet custody, the fatality rate was more than 35%. Less than 1% of Germans detained by the Americans perished while in detention. Despite not having access to these exact figures, the men who surrendered in the spring of 1945 recognized the basic reality they reflected. American imprisonment meant a high chance of survival, while Soviet captivity meant a high chance of death. The first conditions under which German prisoners of war were treated by Americans were challenging. To deal with the sudden influx of surrenders, the Rheinwiesenlager, also known as the Rhine Meadow Camps, were quickly set up in April 1945. At first, hundreds of thousands of German captives were detained in open fields. Resources were greatly strained by the logistical issue of processing 1.5 million prisoners in a single month while continuing active military operations. Conditions were harsh, especially during the first several weeks, with food shortages and subpar shelter, as supply lines could not keep up with the influx. By the summer of 1945, however, prisoners were being moved to permanent camps with adequate amenities, thanks to efforts by Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force to ameliorate conditions. According to the 1974 Maschke Commission investigation, the real number of detainees who died in these camps was between 4,000 and 6,000, or around 1% of the total. Historians have shown that author James Back's Other Losses column reflected administrative transfers and discharges rather than fatalities, thus discrediting his claims of 800,000 to 1 million deaths. The degree of this predilection may be seen in the speed with which organized German resistance fell apart in the West, while the savage battle raged on in the East until the last day. Examine the distribution of German casualties. Historian Rüdiger Overmans' conclusive statistical analysis estimated that there were roughly 5.3 million German military deaths. Of these, about 4 million died on the Eastern Front, accounting for 75 to 80% of all German war fatalities, while about 1 million died on the Western and other fronts. The intensity of the warfare, the lack of mercy, and the will of both sides to fight to the end resulted in casualty numbers that were significantly higher than those in the West. Between April 16th and May 2, 1945, German forces lost between 92,000 and 100,000 soldiers, 220,000 were wounded, and 480,000 were captured during the Battle of Berlin alone. Alongside Wehrmacht regulars, the Hitler Youth and Volkssturm fought to protect the city, house by house, street by street. The supply of food, ammunition, and medical equipment ran out. Even as Soviet bombardment destroyed the city, the defenders continued to fight. German units equipped with ammunition, defensive locations, and the ability to resist, on the other hand, decided not to on the Western Front. This dynamic was aptly demonstrated by the Ruhr Pocket surrender. German defenders enjoyed every geographic advantage from April 1st, when American forces finished the encirclement, to April 18th, when the final resistance was put down. Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr, was a heavily populated urban area with infrastructure, companies, and buildings that supported defenders. Army Group B was composed of 19 divisions, 370,000 men, defensive positions, and plenty of ammunition. American forces would have suffered greatly if they had opted to engage in an urban defense a la Stalingrad. Instead, after Model disbanded Army Group B, entire divisions marched into American possession without firing a shot, and mass surrenders started on April 14th. The veteran 116th Panzer Division, which had fought through the Ardennes from Normandy, surrendered without any artillery or tanks that could still be used. However, the men themselves were still alive and able to fight back as infantry. They opted for captivity rather than fight. About 10,000 Americans lost their lives in the Ruhr Pocket's reduction. The number of German surrenders was 317,000. The math of that exchange shows that the majority of Germans surrendered without a struggle, with less than one American killed for every 30 Germans taken prisoner. In April 1945, this trend was replicated throughout Western Germany. Towns and cities surrendered with white flags and minimal resistance, or no resistance at all, as American forces advanced across central Germany and came across what Eisenhower referred to as a whipped army. At the next confrontation, German forces withdrew and surrendered. The story is brutally clear from the daily rate of captures. About 10,000 German prisoners were being taken daily by American and British forces in March 1945. That figure rose to 39,000 every day in the first 2 weeks of April. It reached a peak of 59,000 per day in the last 16 days of April. Not all of these were combat captures of units that were surrounded or vanquished. Many of these were the voluntary surrenders of formations that had left their defensive positions to surrender. These soldiers made a clear strategic assessment. They had already made up their minds and could sense the end was near. They could postpone the inevitable by a few days if they remained in their positions and engaged in combat with the Americans. After that, Soviet forces would invade Germany from the east while they battled valiantly in the west. They would eventually fall into Soviet hands if they retreated eastward. Their only hope of surviving this battle and rebuilding later was with the Americans. By May 1945, astute Germans realized that the Western Allies' willingness to allow German reconstruction was essential to their country's survival. In a sense, German soldiers who turned themselves into the Americans were selecting which Germany they would choose to live in after the war. Understanding how defeat differed in the two theaters is necessary to answer the question of why German soldiers in the East fought so resolutely while the West fell apart. German military may surrender and hope to live in the West. Each commander might figure out that surrendering their men to the Americans saved those lives for Germany's future. Such a guarantee was not provided by capitulation in the East. Given the fatality rate in Soviet custody, surrendering a unit to the Red Army may result in 1 out of every 3 men being executed. After years of ruthless combat, commanders could not bring themselves to sentence their men to that fate without trying every other possible course of action. Furthermore, it was theoretically possible for more German civilians to escape westward and away from the Soviet advance in the east with each day of sustained resistance. Early in 1945, millions of German people, mostly women, children, and the elderly, fled eastern Germany as the Red Army approached, causing a refugee crisis. The stories had also reached these refugees. They took whatever belongings they could handle and fled westward using whatever available means, including foot, horse-drawn carriages, and packed trains. The German armed forces in the East believed that their involvement in the last weeks of the war would protect this civilian exodus. German surrender decisions in 1945 were influenced by a complex interplay of military practicality, national loyalty, individual dread, and collective guilt consciousness. Although some of the guys did show moral awareness of their actions, this was not the main driving force behind their decisions. They were troops deciding how to survive in extremely challenging conditions. They logically assessed which alternative would give them the best chance of surviving the conclusion of the war and decided to surrender to the Americans rather than the Soviets. Their appraisal of post-war conditions, their observation of American treatment of captives, and their awareness of their own crimes on the Eastern Front and the probable Soviet reprisal all influenced that estimate. This dynamic played out with dramatic intensity during the latter days of the war in Europe. German forces in some regions temporarily resumed fighting after the unconditional surrender was signed on May 7 and 8, 1945, in an effort to reach Western lines before the surrender took effect. After the grace period ended, Army Group North surrendered to Soviet forces on May 9 in the Ruhr Pocket in Latvia, where they had been cut off since October 1944. In an effort to reach American positions in Czechoslovakia, German forces engaged Soviet troops in combat. When Czech resistance organizations attacked German forces on May 5, the Prague Uprising broke out, turning into violent street combat. Even after the war was declared finished, German units reacted with excessive violence out of fear that Czech partisans would hand them over to Soviet forces. The conflict didn't end until American and Soviet forces met and drew distinct demarcation lines. For those Germans who did surrender to American forces, the experience of being captured would influence their memory of the war and their relationship with the United States for many years to come. As captives were moved to permanent camps and subsequently deported, the harsh Rheinwiesenlager period gave way to more compassionate treatment. The majority of German prisoners of war who were detained by the Western Allies went home between 1945 and 1948. When they returned, Germany was in ruins, with cities leveled to rubble by strategic bombing, an economy in ruins, and the country split into occupation zones. However, they came back alive. They reconstructed their communities, got married, had children, and depending on where they settled, became citizens of either the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, or the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany. Many turned into fierce defenders of the Atlantic Alliance and Western democracy. The future of the Soviet inmates was drastically different. A system was put in place to extract as much labor as possible before releasing the 480,000 or more prisoners taken during the Battle of Berlin and the millions taken during the last months on the Eastern Front. The war had left the Soviet Union in utter ruins, with 32,000 factories destroyed, 1,700 cities and towns destroyed, and 26 million dead. It would take decades to recover from the economic devastation caused by the German invasion. Despite formally adhering to the Geneva Convention's norms, Soviet authorities put reconstruction ahead of the welfare of the prisoners. German prisoners of war were compelled to work in factories, mines, construction sites, and farms. After the crisis years of 1945-1946, when the Soviet Union was in danger of hunger and prisoners were barely surviving on rations, things became better. Although repatriation was gradual, mortality rates had drastically decreased by 1947 as the Soviet economy stabilized. The final German prisoners of war did not come home until 1956, 11 years after the war ended, although the majority were freed between 1947 and 1950. These surrender choices left a legacy that went well beyond personal survival. In the post-war era, West German society was built on the almost 3 million German soldiers who submitted to Western powers. They came home having witnessed American military might, organizational effectiveness, and a readiness to treat adversaries in accordance with the law. These encounters laid the groundwork for the Federal Republic's Western orientation and NATO membership, as did the Marshall Plan assistance that restored West Germany and the American security guarantee that guarded against Soviet expansion. Many of the German leaders of the generation that established post-war democracy had personally preferred American incarceration to Soviet retaliation. It is still unclear and complicated whether these German soldiers who collectively surrendered in 1945 were held accountable for their involvement in Nazi atrocities. Most of them were never brought to justice. Senior leadership, SS members, concentration camp staff, and those personally involved in particular atrocities were the main targets of war crimes prosecutions. After being captured, the average Wehrmacht soldier usually returned home without being held legally responsible, regardless of whether he had served on the Eastern Front or had observed or taken part in crimes. Millions of men who had taken part in a war of aggression and extermination were able to return to civilian life and become part of post-war society as a result. Different priorities and historical experiences were reflected in the Soviet Union's differing treatment of Germans who had been seized. Soviet officials tried to reconstruct what the German invasion had devastated, using German prisoners of war. Compared to the Western Allies, they detained prisoners longer, worked them harder, and released them more slowly. German troops' decisions regarding capitulation in 1945 frequently dictated which Germany they would later reside in because of the partition of Germany into occupation zones, which solidified into the separation between East and West Germany. The majority of those who gave up in the West went back to West Germany. After being freed, most people who were taken in the East settled in East Germany. The mass German surrender in 1945 is regarded as one of the most spectacular military failures in history when viewed over the decades. It is notable not for its speed, but more for its selectivity. When defeat was certain, German forces did not just surrender. They surrendered to some foes while resisting others. They collectively formed logical survival calculations and took appropriate action. The approximately 3 million people who turned themselves in to the Western Allies were protesting against Soviet captivity and ongoing Nazi resistance with their feet and weapons. They opted for American pragmatism over Soviet retaliation, survival over honor, and the future over the past. This striking figure is thus included in the final analysis of World War II in Europe. German military resistance fell in the West, where men could surrender and expect to live, but fighting persisted in the East, where capitulation could result in death. This disparity is reflected in the casualties. The number of Germans dead and injured much outnumbered the number of captives captured on the Eastern Front. On the Western Front, German prisoners far outnumbered those killed and injured. This divergence has a huge human cost. In 1945, every German soldier who lost his life in combat with the Red Army was a guy who could have survived if he had been battling Americans. In 1945, every Soviet soldier who lost their life in combat with the Germans did so in order to defeat an adversary that was also mass surrendering in the West. The event was both reassuring and unsettling for the Americans who were inundated with surrenders. American troops took satisfaction in treating detainees humanely and abiding by military regulations. The large-scale surrenders demonstrated that German troops understood American justice and discipline. However, American leaders also recognized the reasons behind the Germans' capitulation. The Eastern Front was known to them. They were aware of the actions taken by German forces in the Soviet Union. They knew the Germans were running from justice rather than pleading for forgiveness. In his correspondence with his Soviet counterparts, General Eisenhower had to strike a careful balance between handling the influx of people at his force's doorstep and upholding alliance obligations. The long-term effects of these capitulation choices became evident in the years following the war. With a large population of men who had submitted to the Western Allies, West Germany developed into a thriving democracy and an important ally of the United States. Following their release, many former Soviet prisoners of war settled in East Germany, which the Soviet Union later turned into a communist dictatorship. The psychological effects of these wartime choices continued to influence German society until the two Germanys reunited in 1990. When millions of German soldiers concluded that Americans were foes they could surrender to and live with, the groundwork for unified Germany's Atlantic orientation, its dedication to NATO and European integration, its alliance with the United States, was partially established. In the end, the tale of why German soldiers chose to submit to the Western Allies in such large numbers instead of confronting the Soviets is one of logical decision-making under dire situations. There was no denying the glaring difference between the fates that awaited inmates in the East and the West. The risk of dying in captivity was about 1% for those who turned themselves in to the Americans. There was a greater than 1 in 3 risk that anyone who fell into Soviet hands would never return home. Millions of people chose to walk west. There was no such option for the 480,000 German soldiers who were taken prisoner by the Soviet Union during the Battle of Berlin. They battled to the very last, surrounded in the capital with no American force to surrender to, and then met the fate that their compatriots had been frantically avoiding for months. In the decisive battle, the soldiers who chose to surrender instead of fight encountered no Americans. Rather, they faced a future in which Germany might rebuild, where survival was feasible, and where Americans would be allies rather than enemies. They saved their lives but gave up their firearms. They walked toward those who were most likely to allow them to survive, making the decision that 3 million men facing death would make in the terrible calculus of war's conclusion. The stark asymmetry of German resistance in 1945 can be explained by the fact that they had this option in the West, but not in the East. It clarifies why the Eastern Front continued to fight, while the Western Front fell apart. It explains why Soviet forces had to fight for every structure, every city, and every mile at a great blood cost, while American forces captured almost 3 million prisoners with comparatively few deaths. The basic distinction between two types of captivity, one offered survival, the other sure death, was the key to the Allied triumph in Europe, as was the use of strategic bombing and military tactics. German soldiers recognized this distinction regardless of their philosophy, misdeeds, or allegiance to the Nazi government. They made the decision to live when given the chance. That decision, when multiplied by millions of other judgments made in the spring of 1945, put an end to significant German resistance in the West, hastened the end of the war, and influenced the post-war world in ways that still exist today.